Welcome to Speaking Concretely, the official podcast of the Cement Association of Canada. I'm your host, Adam Auer, President and CEO of the CAC. Today I'm joined by Resha Watkins, Vice President of North American Sustainability at St. Mary's Cement, a Votorantim Cimentos company. St. Mary's has 3 cement plants in Canada, one in the city of Bowmanville, Ontario, one in the town of St. Mary's, Ontario, and a third in Quebec in Port Daniel, Gascon, for a combined production capacity of over 5 million metric tons in Canada and the United States. Resha has been with the company for over 20 years and plays a central role in driving innovation at St. Mary's. I'm excited to hear more about some of the key investments underway at their Canadian facilities. Resha, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. I'm excited to be here.
I want to start with a bit of history because St. Mary's Cement is among the first cement producers in Canada, getting its start in the town of St. Mary's in 1912, over a century ago. Tell us a little bit about how the company has changed and grown in their 113 years in Canada.
Yeah, we've been in Canada for a long time. We started with the single plant in St. Mary's, and we're now part of a large global company with operations in over in 11 countries, with over 50 million tons of cement production capacity. And changing from a family-owned company, even though we're still officially a family-owned company, we operate as a public company, and so it's very much evolved over that time. And with more interaction with our international brothers and sisters, it's certainly we've seen a lot of change in the industry as well.
I mean, St. Mary's is a fairly small and historic town in Ontario. What does a cement plant mean to the town of St. Mary's? How do you connect with and support the community there?
The cement plant itself is really a fixture in the town. And we engage with the community in a number of ways. We have a community liaison committee where we share key information about what's going on with the plant. We also participate in volunteering events in the community, and we sponsor various organizations. And we really try to have an open door policy with our community members. Our site operations manager and environment manager are often, doing tours for community members, and we really try to, we're part of the community there and have been for a long time.
I had the pleasure of visiting the facility last year, and one of the things that, of course, really stands out is the old quarry, which has been transformed into a recreation site for the town.
Yeah.
Maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about that project.
That happened a number of years ago, and we donated the land to the town, and then they converted it into a recreation facility. With we supported that with some donations. But yeah, it's now. In the summer, if you drive past, it's really busy with everyone, with all, kids and families.
Maybe just moving from, the focus on sort of the very local to a more of a national perspective. So you've got the 3 cement plants in Canada. You mentioned that Votorantim is an international company with operations in 11 countries. Do you see a difference between cement production in Canada versus some of the other countries that St. Mary's and Votorantim operate in? Are there things that are easier or harder in Canada in terms of, I guess, sort of alignment with global best practice around cement production?
Yeah, the fundamentals of a cement plant are pretty much the same across Votorantim and the industry. A raw mill is a raw mill, a kiln is a kiln. But countries' construction markets have evolved with some differences, and the market requirements differ from country to country. So the final cement product at our plants in different countries are tailored to those market requirements. For example, cement in Brazil is predominantly sold in bags, although that is evolving too. Whereas in Canada and the US, it's predominantly sold in in bulk to ready mix producers. So what that has meant in our Brazil operations, that they use a much higher percentage of lower carbon supplementary cementitious materials in their cement products versus the industry here in Canada and the US. So here in Canada, we need to evolve more on further, evolving our higher SCM blended cement. So there's things we can learn from our operations overseas uh, uh, for how we produce products here in Canada and the US. So I think evolving the market here is a little more difficult than we've seen in some of our other countries. I would say that's one thing that is very much evident.
I think that's probably kind of surprising it's a bit surprising for me to hear, even because, you're talking about, on the one hand, production and distribution of cement in bags, versus what you would assume is a much more sophisticated market selling in bulk. But it's interesting that doesn't always mean that you're able to deploy best practices around sustainability, for example, as easily in a country like Canada. And I kind of want to pivot to that sort of conversation a little bit, maybe starting with the obvious, that it's a bit of an understatement to say that we're in this kind of interesting moment in history in Canada, internationally, facing an unprecedented level of uncertainty, particularly with President Trump sort of upending the traditions of global trade. And at home, of course, we're in the midst of a federal election right now with significant political upheaval, including some anticipated shifts in the policy landscape around issues like sustainability and climate change and housing affordability. How do you see sort of that uncertainty, particularly in the context of some of the challenges that you just mentioned already? How is this uncertainty impacting St. Mary's, and how it's sort of planning for some of those changes that you mentioned that you'd like to bring to Canadian production?
Lots of contingency planning and trying to be agile is certainly what's happening right now. But decarbonisation is not going away. Approaches on how companies approach it will need to adjust with changing political situations. But the green economy, is and will continue to be a driver of economic activity, and the company is committed to that. I don't see that commitment changing for the industry, for cement and construction. Maybe it'll slow down a little, but I always say the train has left the station, and there's no coming. It's how fast it's going to leave the station, not whether it's left. So, and our company is committed to decarbonisation. So we may need to find alternative ways of making projects happen, making them financially viable, but we will move forward on decarbonisation.
I want to unpack that a little bit, because one of the things I like to point out, when I'm out representing the cement industry, particularly on sustainability issues, is that the industry, both in Canada and globally, is, as you're suggesting, undergoing a historic period of modernization and innovation. And a lot of that is being driven by sustainability, by the imperative sustainability, and particularly the drive to reduce emissions from cement production, which we've talked about a number of times on this podcast. And yet there still is, in the sort of general conversation about sustainability and climate change, this kind of perception, if you will, that the environment and economy are still at odds, that these are trade-offs as opposed to synergistic. And I'm wondering if you could maybe take a minute to describe, what are some of the drivers behind the innovation investments that St. Mary's is making, and how would you describe some of the positive knock-on effects of improving sustainability, efficiency, some of the technological innovations that come along that, what are the benefits to the industry, both from an economic perspective, but also in terms of jobs and, supply chain security, et cetera?
Sustainability really is a driver of innovation and investment in the industry at the moment. And, if I think about our company's last strategic plan cycle, a large percentage of the investments were targeted at decarbonisation. And even those, if we think about Industry 4.0, um, all of the, and AI, it's all about running the plant more efficiently, more consistently. And what that really leads to is uh, energy efficiency, and energy efficiency is part of decarbonisation. So even something like Industry 4.0 has decarbonisation benefits because you're getting more efficient in your operations. Um, but then let's talk about an alternative low carbon fuel project. That certainly supports decarbonisation, but it also supports the circular economy with economic activity generated from processing the waste or byproducts from other industries into usable fuels at our cement plant. So a project like that is generating uh, jobs and investments. So um, I think if you look at every, uh, you can take every type of sustainable, decarbonisation project and find uh, economic activity generated from that project, driving either productivity or investment. Well, they all do investment, but other co-benefits from those projects, not just decarbonisation.
So you mentioned a couple of specific um, innovations there around, low carbon fuels. You also mentioned, the use of SCMs and blended cements. Maybe you could walk our listeners through some of the practical investments that you're making at your plants in Canada as part of that kind of innovation, focus on decarbonization.
Yeah, we talked about you being at the St. Mary's plant last year, and we commissioned our alternative fuels project there. So that's and we're very happy to see the progress that the plant's making on increasing their alternative fuel usage. At our Bowmanville plant, we've been using alternative fuels at the Bowmanville plant for a number of years, but we have expansion initiatives for Bowmanville. We're looking to increase our production of blended cements at Bowmanville with putting in an additional finish mill or cement mill. We're developing a project at our McInnes plant in Quebec for alternative fuels. So we have a number of large investments in the pipeline for the plants in Canada.
What are some of the like the low carbon fuels one is obviously one that is key to the industry's overall roadmap to decarbonization. What are some of the fuels, maybe the most important fuels that you see along that journey?
Um, we use a variety of different alternative fuels. We utilize construction demolition debris, so that's a biomass fuel. We use post-industrial wastes that would otherwise go to landfill. We don't want any, we encourage the hierarchy of waste management. And so we only really want to use uh, materials that would otherwise go to landfill. Um, we, uh, we actually use the nylon from tires. Our plants love that particular material, but we use a variety of different alternative fuels. You know, we want to support. Generally, we try to look for fuels that are close to plants because then you're lower logistics and better cost. Yeah, a large variety of alternative fuels we consider.
So we know the goal. When you look, for example, at the industry's concrete zero action plan, as we call it, our roadmap to decarbonization and ultimately to reduce our emissions to net zero by 2050, that this is an ambitious goal with a whole lot of steps along the way, like some of the investments that you've discussed already. Maybe as sort of one last question, you can share with our listeners, what are some of the kind of interim targets that St. Mary's has set for itself on that journey, and what's the approach that the company adopts to monitor its progress towards those goals and make corrections and make sure that you're staying on the right track?
Yeah, so Votorantim Cimentos as a global company has what we call our 2030 commitments. So they were developed in 2020. So we have targets in 2030 across a number of different pillars, with one of them being decarbonisation. So we have a target for 2030 that has been, we're signed on to the science-based, the SBTI. And so that's been valid at our 2030 CO2.
SBTI is the Science-Based Targets Initiative,
Yeah.
just for those who don't know the acronym.
I got to remember not to use all of the acronyms. But yeah, so we've signed on to that and had our 2030 target validated. So we're driving towards that 2030 target, and we monitor it annually, and we report our global result annually in our annual integrated report. And one of my short term, my bonus is tied. A lot of us have our bonus tied to achieving our annual result, so that. And that's contingent on alternative low carbon fuels implementation, blended cement implementation, what we call our traditional levers, energy efficiency. We're very serious about, it's a public commitment we've made. So we're very serious about driving hard to meet that target that we've committed to publicly.
Clearly, a concern with accountability when you've got your staff's bonuses tied to those sustainability metrics. Yeah.
It makes us all very interested in meeting that target.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. Resha Watkins, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. And I encourage our listeners to check out Votorantim and St. Mary's Cement and their sustainability commitments on the web. And until next time, thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam, for having me.
Thank you to our audience for listening. And don't forget to subscribe and follow our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. We hope to see you next time.